This week on The Sceptic, I speak to Douglas Carswell, former MP for Clacton, on what the right really needs to do to reform Britain.
What we need is to recognise the damage of the Blairite ascendancy and to push back. We don't need a revolution in Britain, we need a restoration. They are the revolutionaries. They are the people who have destroyed the country with a legal coup d'etat.
Chris Morrison, our environment editor, on how the global green agenda is falling apart and the backlash against the Daily Sceptic for leading the way.
He read what we wrote in the Daily Sceptic. He got triggered, and so he came up with this ridiculous comment. A threat that was both very silly and sinister at the same time. Thank God, people like Lord Barwell will never be near the levers of power again.
If I was in charge of Rotherham,
I'd make more venues accessible for people with disabilities and for people of all genders, all races.
And author Stephen Tucker on the ghoulish decision to make Rotherham the 2025 Children's Capital of Culture and what it says about our deranged cultural elites.
I mean, really, it's just a kind of cynical rebranding exercise, which the people involved haven't even noticed could be dismissed as a piece of dark humour. Celebrating diversity is the whole reason why this scandal was able to be covered up in the first place. And the local authorities' apparent solution to this is celebrate diversity some more.
If you're not already a donor, make a donation of at least £5 a month for the Daily Sceptic, log in with the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Donors will also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion threads on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest Daily Sceptic content with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. You can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailyskeptic.org/donate. Now, on with the show. Hello and welcome to episode 32 of The Sceptic. I'm your host, Laurie Wastell, an associate editor at the Daily Sceptic. Now, as many will know, there's been a big falling out in Reform UK. Great Yarmouth MP Rupert Lowe has lost the whip amid an investigation by the party which he says is a witch hunt. The ongoing dispute has become a major headache for leader Nigel Farage, not least because, far from internal squabbling, the insurgent populist party has a vital task ahead of it: turning around Britain's decline. But are they serious enough to do it? Well, to discuss that, I'm very pleased to be joined today by Douglas Carswell, who was the MP for Clacton from 2010 to 2017, and he's now living in America, where he's president and CEO of the Mississippi Center for Public Policy. So welcome to The Sceptic, Douglas.
Hello, Laurie. Lovely to take part in your show. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, great to have you here. Okay, so there are immense problems facing Britain at the moment and immense policy challenges for the British right to face and to try and get to grips with. And obviously this falling out with Lowe and Reform is, an annoyance and a distraction from that. But I suppose just to start with, has this lack of a focus on policy from Reform, has that surprised you at all?
Well, it's difficult, and I speak from first-hand experience. It's difficult for a start-up party, an insurgent party, to come along and to shake things up. I know that because when I joined UKIP and I won a seat for UKIP in a by-election and then held it in a general election, I learnt firsthand quite how difficult it is. It's not just the difficulties that an insurgent party faces with the electoral system. You get all these teething problems. When you create a startup party, you need to have a very charismatic leader, and Reform UKIP certainly has that with Nigel Farage. But equally, as you grow, you need to grow into something more broad-based and collegiate, and it's difficult. These are teething problems, and those who are familiar with the minutiae of the history of UKIP and the Brexit Party and now Reform will be all too familiar with them. I'm not going to get into that because my view is that I don't really care who does the things we need to fix Britain. I just want to see them done. And I don't really have a dog in the fight in the sense that I don't really care if it's the Conservative Party that does this under Kemi or Jenrick, or whether it's Reform that does it. At some point, we need to recognise that the country is heading towards a catastrophe. And it's heading towards a catastrophe not just because of the current Muppets in the government, but because basically since 1997, we have had a succession of Blairite governments. We've had governments, now governments that have not necessarily been led by Tony Blair, in fact, governments that haven't always been Labour governments. But we've had an essentially Blairite succession of prime ministers and governments. That is to say, we've been led by people who, number one, believe that the free market needs to be directed and controlled and regulated by regulators and central bankers. We've had a succession of governments who believe in rights being something created by charters and the universal application of those rights, and indeed who believe in the universal nature of human nature. They don't believe there's anything distinctive or particular about the West or about Britain. And for that reason, we've seen, in a sense, a Blairite coup, a Blairite upending of the British legal tradition. It has empowered remote officials. The Blairite governments have all passed power away from anyone that you can hold to account to unelected officials. And we saw this initially when Blair came in, giving the Bank of England independence, but we saw it too under Boris Johnson, where a committee of experts decided to lock down the country in response to a seasonal flu pandemic. We've seen a succession of Blairite governments, and they have been a disaster and a catastrophe. And fundamentally, what we need is an alternative to this, and only the right can provide that alternative. It may be Labour. It may be Conservative. It may be Reform. It certainly won't be Labour. I'm not really interested in which personality or which bit of which party delivers that leadership. I don't want to get involved in the soap opera, but we do need a fundamental shift in the direction of the country to avert it from disaster. The country is rapidly moving to become a third world country, not only because it is allowing the third world into the country, but because its economic performance, its productivity, and its debt will basically make Britain a second, if not third world country.
Do you think people grasp how much the Human Rights Act has changed our constitution?
Now, I think the right is only just waking up to this, and I think the right is still largely clueless as to what to do to tackle it. Now, we all read about the symptoms when we see a judge allowing an immigrant to stay in the country because his child likes fried chicken or some nonsense like that. We see almost weekly judges making decisions that they shouldn't be making, not just on immigration. We've seen judges decide on whether or not the UK should be able to use gas and oil reserves in the North Sea. Again and again and again, we see judges making decisions that they have absolutely no right to make. And certainly the people on the right rail against the consequences of the empowerment of the judiciary, but they're pretty clueless as to what's caused it and to what to do about it. And I think we need to understand the nature of the problem. It goes beyond simply the actions of one or two judges. Since the Blairites got in 1997, they incorporated the European Convention on Human Rights into UK law. That, number one, allowed judges to adjudicate on the basis of a very vaguely worded charter that empowered them. But it goes beyond that. They created a Supreme Court, Order number 53, I think it is, of which determines the scope of judicial review. This has been extended so that judges can not only strike down ministerial decisions, they can basically mandate what the minister should be doing as a policy in place of what they've struck down. So we've seen through the creation of the Supreme Court and the extension of judicial review, the creation of an almost sort of group of unelected judges empowered to make policy. And this has not really been properly understood, the extent to which this coup has happened. But it's Laurie, if I may say, it's even worse than that. The Blairite legal revolution has not just created a Supreme Court. They have upended the old English common law idea of equality before the law. Equality before the law goes way back, I would say actually probably to Anglo-Saxon tribal tradition, the idea that everyone is bound by the same set of rules. They've overturned this tradition to create a system in Britain where, because of human rights law, different types of people living in our country are treated differently by the law. There are now 9 protected characteristics. These are immutable characteristics. And if you possess, thanks to human rights law, if you possess these immutable characteristics that make you a protected characteristic person, you are treated differently under the law. We have created a legal system in the UK now where state bodies, public bodies, are mandated by the law to discriminate against white English people in England. This is not fantasy. This is actually what has happened. We have created the opposite of equality before the law. We've created a legal hierarchy in which white British people are treated and discriminated against by their legal system in their own country, in defiance of their own legal and folk traditions. This is extraordinary. Let me put it this way, Laurie. Ever since we created all this plethora of human rights legislation, the whole premise of it has been that it would allow judges to guard us against the actions of arbitrary government. But there's one occasion in my life when the government really behaved arbitrarily, when they decided in response to COVID to put me under house arrest, to prevent me from walking around Richmond Park in my own time, to prevent my child from going to a school of our choice, to prevent us going about our lives as ordinary English folk. This was a gross violation of our human rights. They put us under house arrest. And not a single human rights lawyer, not a single human rights judge intervened to stop it. So the idea that human rights legislation protects our liberties is for the birds. It's a nonsense. What it has done instead is create this perverted legal idea that judges may decide on public policy and that the public may be ordered in a hierarchy of preference with English people at the bottom of that ladder in their own country. We need to recognize this. We need to realize that it is morally abhorrent, and we need to overturn it. And if necessary, we need to drive out from the bench judges who, through overreach, make decisions they have no business of making. But it's not just a case of, I think, sacking some judges. That will be necessary. I think we need to do specific things. We need to change Order 53, I think it is, of the Supreme Court to limit the scope of judicial review. We need to abolish the Judicial Appointments Commission so that we don't have judges appointing judges. We need to remove from the bench those diversity hire judges who clearly aren't up to the job. I think we need to investigate whether or not some judges used arbitrary decision-making to unfairly incarcerate British people for expressing opinions online. Clearly, there have been some people in our country who have been sent to prison, not for committing a criminal offence, not for incitement to violence, but for simply saying things that the judge found to be obnoxious. We need far-reaching reform of the judiciary, starting with judicial review, judicial appointments process. I think we also need to look at the 2003, I think it is, Communications Act. That makes it a criminal offence to say things that are grossly offensive. Now, I hope that some of the things that I've just been saying to you will be deemed grossly offensive by most judges in Britain. I'm not doing my job properly if I haven't said something that grossly offends them. But in a free country, you should be able to say things that someone else says they find grossly offensive. It shouldn't be a crime to say things that are grossly offensive. In a free society, unless you're able to say things that someone else finds offensive, you're not able to articulate and debate things that need to be articulated and debated. So we need some far-reaching reforms, I think, if we are to undo the damage of the Blairite ascendancy.
And I should add that the 2003 Communications Act, not only does it criminalise saying grossly offensive things online, but it criminalises saying them even in private, in a private WhatsApp, for example, and even if no one there is actually offended.
There was one of these judges, I can't remember his name, but I suspect he was a diversity hire given his background, who not only incarcerated some, I think there were police officers for saying in a WhatsApp group some pretty obnoxious things. Don't get me wrong, the people who said these things in a WhatsApp group were pretty obnoxious and offensive. But being obnoxious and offensive is not a crime. And yet not only did the judge who put them in prison do so, rather alarmingly, this diversity hire judge who doesn't appear to understand the traditions of English liberty also sits on the Judicial Appointments Commission as one of the commissars. This is simply intolerable.
And so a key point about the Judicial Appointments Commission is that it's billed as this sort of independent Blairite quango. And of course, we've seen this as well recently with the Sentencing Council, which is both an independent quango, but also one stuffed with lawyers. So there's kind of both elements of it there. But there's this idea, isn't there, that if you hive off bits of parliamentary sovereignty to these independent bodies, then the decisions that they make will somehow be independent and they'll be expert and they'll be sort of better than the decisions that would be made otherwise. But in fact, they often come out with these quite outrageous decisions, as with these new sentencing guidelines. And so how important is it to get away from that assumption that just because it's independent, it's automatically assumed to be better?
Britain is in the mess it is because these powers have been given to unelected bodies. So, for example, the Independent Bank of England was so incompetent at controlling the currency, they presided over, first of all, a banking crisis over a decade ago, and then runaway inflation. The Migratory Advisory Commission was so incompetent at its job that it allowed 2 million people of low skilled into the country without asking fundamental questions as to whether or not those arrivals' skills were needed. In fact, they've lowered the per capita GDP of the country, and without asking fundamental questions about cultural compatibility. I would say a lot of those recent arrivals come from backgrounds that make them culturally incompatible. They will never become British and certainly never become English. So why have we let 1 in 27 people now living in the UK into the country in the past 24 months? Because we gave the power to a panel of experts. The sentencing commissioners that you talk about, again, they've come up with a proposal that is fundamentally hostile to the principle of equality before the law. So again and again and again, we like this idea of the disinterested expert, the technocrat, the person in command of all the information, making dispassionate decisions. The reality is that when you give people like that power, they incarcerate you in your house for months at a time because they are so blinded to one set of data, to one set of expert spreadsheets that they've got, that they can't see the bigger picture. It is no way to run a country. In fact, it is a way to run a country into the ground. Giving unaccountable experts power has been the ruin of the country. And yet it's been the one constant of all the Blairite governments we've had since 1997. They've all done it. They've all done it. Blair did it. Cameron did it. Brown did it. May did it. Boris Johnson did it. This is what defines that succession of disastrous prime ministers as the Blairite ascendancy. What we need is to recognize the damage of the Blairite ascendancy and to push back. We don't need a revolution in Britain. We need a restoration. They are the revolutionaries. They are the people who have destroyed the country with a legal coup d'etat, who have destroyed the country with an anti-democratic, technocratic coup d'etat. What we need is ordinary people of England, British people, the English folk, to recognize that their country has been destroyed by the Blairite ascendancy and to mobilize to push back against it. We can fix the country. We can solve the country's problems. We don't need to go the way of failing third world countries. We can restore the country, but a restoration requires us to understand the full scale of the disaster of the Blairite ascendancy. They're all the same, incidentally. There's no fundamental philosophical distinction between David Cameron's government and Tony Blair's government, or between Boris Johnson's pathetic administration and the catastrophe of Gordon Brown's government. They're all fundamentally the same. I won't be rude and say, in the infamous words of George Galloway, that they're different butts of the same arse, but they are basically the same Blairite ascendancy, and they have been a catastrophe for the country.
And so we've talked about the legal coup and also the coup of the technocrats. But I think a third aspect of the Blairite ascendancy has been multiculturalism and the sort of subverting of neutral processes of the law. And in particular, we have ideas like community policing now. But I've also been doing some research recently on the way that hate crimes are treated by the state. And this depends to a large extent on what are called hate crime scrutiny panels. And, well, who's on the panels? It's representative of victim groups, but only certain groups, right? And so this is kind of instantiating this paradigm where some groups get special favours and others don't. But how important is it? I mean, I think it'll be very difficult, but how important is it to unpick that whole multicultural paradigm to return to a neutral application of the rule of law?
Again, we don't like the consequences of this multicultural agenda because we can see the unfairness of it. It elevates certain groups above others. It gives certain people with certain characteristics, often, for example, Muslims or certain minority groups, sort of elevated say. It undoes and dilutes the fundamental idea that the police are the public and the public are the police and the police are the public. It instead defines the police as agents of the state, with certain ethnic interest groups having a closer whisper in their ear than others. What we need to do is not just push against the consequences of this multicultural mess. We need to go back to first principle. Why have we ended up here? The Blairite ascendancy, all of them, fundamentally believe in the universal condition of humankind. They believe that all people are basically interchangeable, that if you take an Eritrean who turned up in Britain 5 minutes ago, he's only a few moments away, a few degrees away from becoming an Englishman. Now, this is a nonsense. We know this is a nonsense. We know that their cultural influences and perhaps differences of time preference and differences of aptitude mean that actually people are not interchangeable. You can't take an Eritrean and make him English any more than you can take an Englishman and make him an Eritrean. And yet, because of the ideology of the universalists who believe in human nature being the same, we have seen a series of policies pursued that are disastrous. If you believe that all humans are interchangeable and you have a shortage of skilled humans in Birmingham or Manchester, the solution is just to import people from the rest of the world to make up the gap. We've seen this ideology for 30, 40 years. It's the argument in favor of mass immigration. We're told that we need mass immigration because it's going to be good for the economy. It's not. It's been a disaster. If you look at the stats, quite clearly we have imported people into the country who don't produce much economically, who are a net fiscal burden to the country. Nearly half of all people living in social housing in London were born overseas. If you look at some of the stats that are now emerging, looking at benefit claimants, something like nearly half of all people from Congo living in the UK are on some form of benefit. Now, why the heck are we importing people from the Congo? We have no historic connection with the Congo. People from the Congo are not known as great innovators in science and technology. They are, if you look at the data, known as disproportionately likely to commit offences, have a higher propensity towards violence, and be more likely to live at public expense. Why are we importing large numbers of people from a country like that? The answer is because we're governed by fanatical ideologues, extremists, who believe that someone from the Congo is only a short moment away from becoming British or English. This is a fantasy way of running a country, and it's not sustainable anymore. So we need to recognize that the myth of the elite that human nature is interchangeable is the root cause of the problem. And we need to push back against this. Now, for years, if anyone had said what I've just said, they would have been shouted down for being racist or culturalist or a supremacist. Well, let's have this conversation. Not all cultures are the same. They're simply not. Some cultures are better at sending manned missions to Mars, and some cultures are better at committing gross outrages in Rotherham. Not all cultures are the same. So why do we pretend they're the same? And why do we pretend that by allowing large numbers of people from Kashmir into the UK, we're somehow creating a generation of doctors and engineers? We're not. We're creating huge social problems. And we need to recognize and address this. We need the cultural confidence to be able to assert that we believe as British people that the British way of life is better than other ways of life. Now, if you disagree with that basic premise, there's nothing to stop you from going and living your life elsewhere. You can go and live in a different country, but I happen to believe that the US, UK, Anglosphere way of life is the best way to live your life. That's why I choose to spend my life living in the Anglosphere. Once we have the cultural confidence to assert that we believe that in our societies, our way of life is the better way of life, and once we have the moral courage and the moral authority to recognize that, we can perhaps begin to push back and say, we're not going to, out of moral fear, invite the local imam to join our local police watchdog. We don't need to, because we're a democracy and anyone in the community is free to be involved in community policing and community engagement. We don't need to make special allowances for particular groups out of a misplaced sense of guilt. We don't need to, in pursuit of community cohesion, break up the community and categorize it by ethnicity. This is England, land of the English. Everyone is equal before the law. If you want to live here, you must accept the basic premise that all are equal, all will be treated individually under the law. And if you don't like it, and if you want to live a different way of life, you're free to leave. And we need to begin to say that. We begin to need to make these arguments.
And I do wonder, I mean, there's that tendency towards universalism, isn't there? You know, assuming that everyone's like us. It's this very ideological view, as you say. And I think that goes all the way back to the 1948 British Nationality Act, which sort of almost forgot to define who we were and what British citizenship consisted in. And so I wonder if we're taking a path towards reasserting what that cultural identity is, would it also be necessary to reassert legally what, you know, the British and English identities are?
I think so. I mean, I always sort of just lazily regarded myself as British. Ethnically, I'm part English, part Scottish, part Irish. I used to be English when I watched the rugby. I used to be British most of the rest of the time, and I didn't really give it much thought. But I began to, when I represented Clacton, begin to actually identify much more closely with Englishness, because I began to, amongst the people I represented, feel this sense of alienation from the establishment, that we're being overlooked in our own country. And I remember the first time I put a St. George's cross on my car in April on St. George's Day. And I remember thinking, this isn't just about football. There happened to be a football tournament at around the same time. I was picking up from my constituents this idea that actually there's an identity, an English identity, that hasn't been spoken to. I think in a weird way, the Universalists have ended up bizarrely doing the opposite of universalism. What their universalism has paradoxically done is treated people differently on the basis of their race and their ethnicity. And one of the consequences of this, it's begun to awaken this sense of, and it's dismissed as ethno-nationalism, but it's only ethno-nationalism when it's white British people saying it. It's actually, I think, a sort of deeper ethnic identity. And it's begun to stir this identity up. And I'm not sure that the left is going to like the results, because I think once English people begin to define themselves as English and begin to ask themselves basic questions and begin to play back the tape they've had played to them for so long, but substituting every other group with the words English, I think actually you will see a very strong sense of English identity emerge from this. I think it would be a good thing. I mean, I hope that English identity never becomes a sort of twee picture postcard idea of, you know, Morris dancers prancing around a maypole or people wearing bowler hats. But I think there is a search for a more fundamental, meaningful English identity. And it's not going to be about Morris dancers. It's not going to be twee. It's going to be a recognition that this is the country that produced Shakespeare, that produced Charles Darwin, that produced Jane Austen, that produced Alan Turing. This is a country that led the world with the Industrial Revolution, with the Democratic Revolution, with the rule of law. This is a country that has produced not just an economically and technologically innovative society that's barely been surpassed outside the Anglosphere, but a country that has produced a morally better, a morally superior way of life. That is why this country abolished the slave trade. That is why this country is so popular amongst people from non-Western countries who want a better way of life, because our way of life is a better way of life. That is why people try to cross the English Channel, not because France is so hellishly dreadful, but because the English way of life is a better way of life. I think we're beginning to see the stirrings of this recognition from the English, that they don't need to apologize. They don't need to decolonize Shakespeare. Shakespeare, as I think your own Toby Young famously said, Shakespeare is not an example of English cultural exceptionism. It's evidence of English cultural exceptionism, and we should embrace it. We should relish it. We should glory in it. We should glory in being English. We should glory in being British. We shouldn't apologize for it. And we should assert English ideas about equality before the law. And we should, I think, ultimately be prepared to remove from office an essentially un-English, un-British, anti-British elite that has run the country for 30 years. The Japanese went through a similar process in the late 19th century. They were governed by the same parasitical elite for 400 years, an elite that had held the country back, made it insular, made it particularly ill-suited to modernity. The Japanese realized in the late 19th century that if they didn't adapt their country, if they didn't change the way the country was run internally, they would end up like all those other Asian countries being dominated by the European powers. And so they had not a revolution, they had a restoration, the Meiji Restoration. And they overthrew the parasitic elite that was holding the country back. Britain needs a British version of the Meiji Restoration. We must learn from that other island nation, Japan, and we must fundamentally change the way our country is run. We need to change if we are to preserve what is good about our country, because the people running our country now are hurtling us off a precipice, economically and demographically.
Well, I think that's all we've got time for, but I think those kinds of sentiments are certainly the kind of thing that Reform or any other populist right party will need to be taking up if they want to effect the kind of change that we need. Douglas Carswell, thank you very much for coming on The Sceptic.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Now, with the return of Donald Trump to the White House, the net zero agenda globally is falling apart.
Drill, baby, drill.
And while we're very pleased about that here at the Daily Sceptic, the green ideologues of days past are still clinging desperately to their alarmist narrative, even as it collapses around them. Will they ever learn? Well, to discuss that, I'm very pleased to be joined by our environment editor, Chris Morrison. Welcome to The Sceptic, Chris.
Hi, Laurie. Thanks for inviting me back. Pleased to be here.
Okay, so we're used to criticism for our outspoken stance on the green agenda here at the Daily Sceptic, but we did have a quite interesting and really quite bizarre example of it recently in the form of Gavin Barwell. So that's actually now Lord Barwell, who was Chief of Staff to Theresa May during her time as Prime Minister. And so he was responding to an article by you, and he issued this bizarre legal threat, which was, I suspect the next generation may pursue people like you and Toby Young, our editor-in-chief, who sought to delay climate action for damages. Now, Chris, what was it that you had written that had precipitated this strange outburst?
Yes, it was a remarkably, as I pointed out, it was a threat that was both very silly and sinister at the same time. He basically got upset when we started talking about the chemistry of carbon dioxide, the so-called devil gas that's going to lead to runaway temperatures. And he got triggered, if you like. The article I wrote was a result of the proposal in America that the endangerment finding that carbon dioxide is a threat to human existence is quite possibly going to be removed within the Trump administration at some point. And this will have a sort of cascading effect on the way that a lot of federal bodies look at CO2 and the laws behind it, and obviously the promotion of net zero. And so I wrote a piece on this. It was a number of other people wrote in the Daily Sceptic similar articles, or other articles about the endangerment finding. But I looked at took the opportunity to look at the chemistry of CO2, because I've always held that the way to criticize net zero is, yes, look at the effects that it has, the destruction of our societal and economic progress, the ridiculousness of actually trying to remove hydrocarbons from a modern industrial society, the horrendous costs involved. These things are all being gone into in great detail now. But I've also said there's if you look at the chemistry, because if carbon dioxide is the so-called devil gas that is going to lead to runaway temperatures and we're all going to boil, we have to get rid of hydrocarbons. I mean, I've always said that. There's no doubt about it, because we can't have a world where the temperature is rising 10 degrees, 20 degrees, or whatever the alarmists sort of suggest. And so we look, therefore, at carbon dioxide. And the whole of net zero rests on a small trace gas, CO2, a hydrocarbon, and or rather the effects of burning hydrocarbons. CO2 has risen slightly in the atmosphere, and we probably have contributed to some of that increase. But you have to look at the 600 million year record. And from that, you will see that CO2 levels have been 10, 15, maybe even higher levels than that. There is no direct link, as far as we can see, between rising temperatures and or links between carbon dioxide and temperatures. We know that we're now at a period of denudation, that we're at 400 parts per million. If it goes down to about 150 parts per million, all the plants will die, and therefore life on Earth will die. We know that plants have evolved to take in 3 times the amount of CO2 that's currently in the atmosphere, and in fact grow better at that level, as they have done in the past. So therefore, is there a real problem with CO2? There's other scientific theories that, of course, are banned in discussion in the mainstream, that it saturates at certain levels, that it's overridden by water vapor, which is a much more, there's much more water vapor in the atmosphere than CO2. There's also other greenhouse gases that within very narrow bands of the infrared spectrum also warm at the same time as carbon dioxide. And there is people who suggest that it saturates in the same way that if you double lag your loft, you won't trap twice as much heat. You've already trapped a great deal of it. So there are these other theories. And certainly those theories suggest tie much more with the 600 million year observational record, rather than this new idea that humans control the climate thermostat by putting CO2 in. So I took the opportunity to write a little bit about that, which I've done in the past. And Lord Barwell seemed to have got triggered by it. He suggested that Toby, obviously who was tweeting it at the time, and his mate, i.e. yours truly, will be in future generations, will come after us for damages. Which is astonishing, really, because I don't think discussing carbon dioxide is illegal at the moment. I mean, I'm sure there are people who would like it to be, the Jim Dales of this world, and even Dale Vince, I think, has suggested that science denial, or as they call it, should be criminalised. But I don't think it's a realistic suggestion that discussing a gas in the atmosphere should be criminalised. But he did appear to suggest that it was, and it was even worse than that as a free speech issue. He was suggesting, since we know that it's not illegal at the moment, that a future generation, so presumably they'll have to pass retrospective laws. And what I would say to that is, thank God, people like Lord Barwell will never be near the levers of power again. And thank God, I think also you have to ask yourself, the Conservative Party, or if it wants to be a realistic government in the future, ought to, move away from people like Barwell. And of course, Barwell has form on this because he was kicked out in the 2017 general election when Theresa May called the election, and Morrison almost lost it to a Marxist Labour leader. And he then became her chief of staff. And of course, he was no doubt heavily involved in Theresa May's probably one of the worst prime ministers in living memory, although there is actually a lot of candidates, I think, for that. Theresa May herself, in the dying days of her premiership, was looking around for something that someone will remember her about, and chanced upon this idea that the Climate Change Act, which said that we had to move, I think, to 80% removal, net zero by 2050, she pushed it up to 100%. And somehow the 600 nodding donkeys in the House of Parliament all agreed with her and nodded it through in 40 minutes. No cost analysis, no idea of what they were doing, all this sort of thing. I assume that Lord Barwell is one of the last remaining people who actually believed that was a good idea. And as I say, once he read what we wrote in Daily Sceptic, he got triggered, and so he came up with this ridiculous comment.
Yes, and you say triggered there, and of course this is just one tweet, but it is reflective of a broader response to our commentary and commentary like it, which is not just to sort of debate it or to criticise it or to say it's factually wrong or anything else, but rather to try and, which it isn't, but anyway, but to try and shut it down or punish it or censor it in some way. And well, given the changes that are now coming in America, and you mentioned, I mean, the endangerment finding being a particularly significant one, does this suggest rather that the climate alarmists are losing the argument?
Yes, I think they are. I mean, net zero is essentially dead around a lot of parts of the world. It's dead in the United States, it's as dead as a dodo, and is for 4 years. And if Trump 2.0 is successful, we probably will have someone like President Vance, and it will continue for another 4 years or so. It's been ruthlessly removed from almost every federal bureaucracy. I mean, people like NASA have been told to go back to launching space rockets rather than sort of producing all this stuff on the climate. They've all been told to stop it. Just stop it. It's just a waste of money. And because it's not real science, it's just fear mongering. So it's dead in the States. They are drilling for hydrocarbons. All of the green stuff is the subsidies are going to be removed as soon as possible. It's dead in China because although they pay lip service to it, their coal production has gone through the roof in the last 4 years, even though they said that they were going to sort of phase it out or phase it down. It's shown no sign of that at all. They're quite happy to sell us all these useless windmills and whatever. And it's dead in India. They don't go along with it. And it's starting to be dead in places like Argentina. They're starting to have second thoughts. Even the European Union is starting to push back from some of the more crazy things. But we are stuck. We are stuck with this ridiculous government. I don't really think you'd call it a left wing. It's certainly not a working class government. It's a government of the North London dinner party circuit who have got this ridiculous idea, this luxury belief that you can somehow get rid of hydrocarbons because, of course, it fits their collectivist view of world government. And you force everybody to go down this line because once you control hydrocarbons, you control the way people live, the diets, how they travel, you control the whole of society. And so we are stuck with this dreadful government that have this ridiculous idea that you can remove hydrocarbons from modern society and are driving us over the cliff. It's as simple as that. You hear talk about Miliband is being sacked and that sort of thing. I don't really go along with that because if Miliband was sacked, there are 100 other eco-zealots sitting on the Labour bench ready to take his place. Let's just very briefly give you one example. The Climate and Nature Bill, which went before Parliament, I think it was about a month ago, which we covered in great detail. This was going to remove all hydrocarbon use within 6 to 10 years. And this included hydrocarbon use of everything we bring in from overseas import. That would reduce hydrocarbon use in our modern economy to probably about 10%, 10% of what we have now, within 6 to 10 years. That would lead to almost immediate economic and societal collapse. It would be the end of democracy. It would be the biggest ape would be the person who collects all the food, because 10% means no power for anybody else. That would be solely used for emergency use in hospitals, that kind of thing. Yet 200 MPs were said to be in favour of this bill, including 2 Conservative MPs. You know, the old buffers, Roger Gale, and I forget the other chap, but these 2 speaking. And, you know, I spent 4 hours watching the debate, 4 hours I shan't alas get back in my life. Watching them talk about, yes, we know it's flawed, but this is the good thing to do, and all this rubbish they come up with, you know. So you have to sort of despair that, you know, that you still have this, you know, governing elite, you could call it. It's mainstream, the BBC, obviously all the media. This governing elite who have these still crazy ideas. And as I say, I think that I didn't expect, you know, the reaction. You know, I just wrote a piece basically about the science, CO2. There's nothing controversial. It was, I think, quite fair. Just put out all of the alternative views. I just didn't expect Lord Barwell to be triggered, but maybe looking back on it, I can see why he was.
Okay, and so you mentioned wind turbines there, and that's, of course, one of the things that the green net zero movement in this country very much pins its hopes on. And one of the ironies there, of course, is that these actually, and solar farms as well, can be quite damaging to the natural world and the environment, in fact. And, well, I know you've been writing a bit on that recently, Chris. Tell us about your most recent discovery.
Yeah. They're an ecological disaster zone. As you would imagine, if you stick up a wind turbine, for instance, practically the size of a shard in the middle of deserted countryside, you are going to kill everything, as far as I can see. I mean, we've written articles about the bats. It's estimated that millions of bats around the world are killed. But worse than that, it's the large raptors that rely on wind currents that just fly into these things, and the scale of death of eagles in America, the golden eagles, are being chewed up by these things, and also before I mentioned the solar farms, the dangers they pose is that they pose a great deal of danger to insect life. Is starting to be realised. There's not been much work done on this, and so we tried to look at what work there has been done. There was a survey, I think, in Germany that found that each wind turbine, this was in 2016, killed 40 tons of insects per turbine a year. And the Heartland Institute extrapolated that to, I think, 13.5 quadrillion insects were being killed per year. which is quite a lot of insects, although admittedly there are lots and lots of insects around. But they are a major problem for insects because the swarms, and we're talking about moths, butterflies, bees, as well as the flies and all the midges and all that, they just get swept up by these enormous, and these blades sweep the countryside. Now, there's another problem. There's a circular movement in that the insects are killed. That attracts bats and birds, who also then fly into the turbines. The bats fall to the ground, where they're scavenged by foxes and rabbits, or small rats and small animals. They then attract the eagles, who then fly in to get them, and they get crunched as well. So there's this wonderful circular, wonderful's not the word perhaps, circular killing field, this circular killing field that these damn things set up. The solar farms, the problem with the solar farms is that that the birds, large birds, tend to look at them, and they look from the air as if they're lakes, and they dive into them. And there's many cases of birds doing that. They also produce a dead ground underneath. The earth goes dead. You get a lot of you get insects, but you get a different type of insect. You change the ecology. You get the ones that prefer the shade, and of course you totally take out any wildlife, any agricultural life, which of course will probably cut down your insect life. So you're turning these things into industrial wastelands in both the windmills and the solar farms. None of this. You look at the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, the insect, operations. You look at all of them, and there's not a dicky bird. There's not to use a word, there's not a single thing written about it, not a single complaint, not a single cause for worry, all of this sort of thing. But it is happening, and it will get much worse when we blanket the place with these non-environmentally friendly turbines and solar farms.
Okay, and so there's another story that you've written about recently, which is the supposed fact that spring is getting warmer much more rapidly than other seasons. And this is from the BBC. And I know you've been very critical of this, Chris. Tell us what's wrong with it and what you think is perhaps exaggerated.
Well, critical of facts. That this is a chap called Simon King, who I think is their lead weather presenter, and he wrote a story about how, as you say, spring is the fastest warming season in the UK, and that since 1970, spring has warmed by 1.8 centigrade, according to figures from the Met Office. So the first port of call is the Met Office, and if you look at the graph that you can download quite easily for the average temperature in spring, you will find that the temperature from 1970 to current has gone up by 1.3, not 1.8. That's the first thing. The second thing is you notice that 1970 is the low point, that the temperature actually dropped from 1940 to about 1970. And at that time, global cooling was all the rage. 97% of scientists all agreed that we were heading for a new ice age. I remember it, sadly, since I've been on this planet a few decades. I remember it well. I think I bought a book about it, global cooling. Anyway, it was so that was, they picked the low point. If you look back to about 1945, which is 80 years ago, the cooling has been a 0.8. So we come down from 1.8, God knows where they found that figure, down to 1.3, down to taking a longer range of 80 years, which probably gives you a more accurate record of what's happening, down to 0.8. But we can go even further than that, because I think we perhaps might talk about it in greater detail in a minute. If you look at the Met Office figures, there's been enough work done in the last year, particularly on places like Daily Sceptic, that shows that you really can't trust these figures, because they've been so corrupted by heat corruptions, all sorts of things, that we know that most of their weather sites are in junk, class 4 and class 5, with uncertainties according to the World Meteorological Organization of 2 and 5 centigrade respectively. So I think it's scientifically reasonable to look at that 0.8 figure from 1945 and to knock it down a 0.2, maybe 0.3. So you're looking maybe that since that time, it's probably gone up 0.5, 0.6, if you're looking at figures that haven't been corrupted by heat, which is a slightly different story to the one that was presented by the BBC. Only it wasn't necessarily presented by the BBC. It was actually subbed, as far as I could see, from a press release from a company called Climate Central. Climate Central are an American operation. and they specialise in custom-made catastrophe cover for unquestioning journalists, as I call them. And they're funded by, I think it's something like 20 foundations from the Green Blob. All the usual suspects are there, all providing money to provide a stream of these sorts of stories. And they are very successful. They've got a flood tool that you can use, and this is very handy. The Mirror got caught in this particular one recently where they said that London was going to be underwater within 80 years. And then you often see in local papers, I think the Wiltshire Times said that Gloucester Cathedral was going to be, that water was going to be lapping on the steps, even though it's 19 metres above sea level within a relatively short period. And what you can do is you can go to the tool and you can download all your own local stories about how all the much-loved landmarks are all going to be underwater. The only problem is that they use pathways and they use the various information they put in that assume that sea level is going to be 20, 30 times higher than it is at the moment. But they don't necessarily say that. So Climate Central has got form on this as long as you're on. Whenever you see any of this thing, anything to do with flood, now it seems temperatures, always look to see where it came from. And if it comes from Climate Central, well, I mean, you might need to count the spoons, put it that way. Maybe a full audit of the canteen might be in order.
And I suppose we shouldn't be completely surprised at how uncritically the BBC is accepting this kind of thing. But it is still quite shocking, isn't it, Chris?
Yeah, why are they doing it? Why are they doing it? They are simply making themselves look stupid. This goes on and on. The great Paul Homewood, who's, as you know, writes for us occasionally, is a retired accountant. He's been doing this for sort of 12, 15 years since he retired. I could argue that he's got more nous, more integrity, more questioning ability in his little finger than the entire climate desk at most of these publications. There are 10 people, at last count, at the BBC writing this stuff. I mean, they don't seem to be particularly well employed, and obviously I don't hear the full output across the BBC. But they come up with these occasional stories. As I say, in the case of Mr. King, seem to be sort of heavily subbed from another source. Why do they do it? Because Homewood often debunks a lot of this stuff. He writes a small book every year, which includes all of the nonsense that they do, all of the sort of the way that they slant all these extremist stories and wildfires and extreme weather events. The problem all these people have is that the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in its wisdom, and it doesn't always have a lot of wisdom, it is a highly biased body run by the United Nations, but nevertheless, they say that there is no sign that extreme weather is basically getting worse and that we're not responsible, and there's no sign it's getting worse for the next 80 years. And if you look at all of these figures, the flooding, the wildfires, all of this stuff, there's no sign that these events are getting worse. And a lot of this copy is predicated on it getting worse. So they will try and suggest the temperature is moving. But you can't rely. The stuff they're relying on is just a scientific joke to an extent. Not to an extent, is a scientific joke. They're too unreliable. So they look out the window. The Jim Dale sort of form of weather forecasting. Join the dots, they say. There's a rainstorm. It's very heavy, and we're all going to die. It's juvenile. I mean, you wonder, why is the BBC doing it? Unless, because it is easily debunked. Why are they doing it? It's because, I guess, they just don't care. They don't care that Paul Homewood does a book on all their nonsense, because they're following a narrative. And the narrative is much more important. The narrative is produced by the people who pay their salary. The narrative is produced by the people who all go to their North London dinner parties. The narrative is produced, as I might suggest, as a left-wing collectivist agenda, and they're all fully signed up to it. And the idea, we often talk about it, the noble lie. They possibly know that a lot of what they're writing is pseudoscience, is unprovable. There are plenty of other explanations for it. But the noble lie is they believe in net zero, they believe that the world is going to hell in a handcart climate-wise, and therefore, as far as I can see, they feel that anything they say is justified. In the same way that the Met Office has a set of weather sites, 380 weather sites, that are essentially junk. you cannot. They tell us we can measure the temperature down to 1/10 of a degree centigrade, and yet 80% of their weather stations have uncertainties, according to the WMO, the World Meteorological Organization, between 2 and 5 centigrade.
Yeah, and of course the BBC is one organisation that we should be able to trust in this regard. And another of those is the Met Office. And I know that, in fact, a lot of your reporting on this, Chris, has really been being followed up elsewhere now. But there's this scandal about the Met Office temperature measuring stations. And, how much more widely is that becoming known now, Chris?
Well, I think we can claim we started the ball rolling. Last March, I did a Freedom of Information Act that asked the Met Office. They have 383 weather stations, and I knew that they were rated by the World Meteorological Organization from Class 1 to Class 5. And I knew that, the Class 1 was pristine. It had no margin of error. It would have been in an open field. It would have given you a good temperature reading for a large area around. And we go up to Class 4 with uncertainties of 2 centigrade, and then Class 5 of 5 centigrade. Now, it all depends. They class them on how near they are to tarmac, roads, substations, shade, all sorts of things, except Class 5, where they're saying, well, anything could be a weather station. It'd be next to a blast furnace. There aren't any. We found that nearly 80% of the Met Office stations were actually in Class 4 and Class 5. And I think something like 30% were in Class 5, junk Class 5, or super junk Class 5, as I call it, because Class 4, of course, is junk. So we found that, and that opened a Pandora's box, because once you know that, you can start to look at all of these so-called records they constantly produce, which tend to be, or almost certainly would be in Class 4 and Class 5. You can start to ask, well, if you tell me that 2023 was 0.6 degrees cooler than 2022, you have to ask, well, how on earth can you use those sites to give you a precision of 1/100th of a degree centigrade? In fact, you can't. See, what happened with these sites is that they've been going around for a long time, and gradually, in the old days, they were used for. It didn't matter if they were, completely accurate. A man would trot out and look at it at midday and tap it and make a reading, and sometimes he didn't do it and whatever. But it gave you a good trend. It told you when the spring was starting and all that sort of stuff. It was useful for agricultural reasons, for weather forecasting, but they weren't that accurate in the sense to the 100th degree. But it didn't matter. They weren't for that purpose. But now, of course, they've been weaponized in the interests of net zero, and they've forgotten that in order to do that, you need to really shake up the site, because the sites involved are really useless for the purposes that they're using them to scare people with 10th of a degree increases in temperature using these sorts of junk sites. And we've done a lot of work. Shown how there are airports next to. There's one in the middle of a solar farm. It was just built up around it, and they didn't move it. And the amount of heat that's involved there would be quite considerable. And then, of course, we had the national joke, as I call it, the 40.3 centigrade temperature at RAF Conisbee. And we then found from a Freedom of Information Act that there were 3 Typhoon jets landing at the time, and the record actually stood for 60 seconds. And it was followed by a spike up and down of 0.6 centigrade. And this record was one of the records at the time. The Met Office declared it as a milestone in climate history. And of course, it was nothing of the sort. The other great thing is a chap called Ray Sanders, who I always give a shout out to. He's another chap, a retired fellow, who's made it his sort of retired life's work to look at all of these weather stations. And he's come up with some amazing statistics. He discovered, again through another Freedom of Information Act, that the Met Office provides a 30-year average of certain sites, or they were called certain sites. So you type in a weather station, and it will give you the coordinates of the weather station, and it will give you a 30-year rolling average of temperature from that site. He found that 103 of those sites, out of about 300 in this particular data set, didn't exist. They were non-existent. They either had existed or they closed, and the Met Office was estimating data ever since. And not only did he do that, because the Met Office then sort of hastily changed it to a location specific, and they took out the coordinates of the actual station, and then they tried to sort of suggest it was just a general location. Okay, so the estimable Sanders then put in a station called Cawood, which is in the East Riding of West Riding of Yorkshire. Cawood is one of, I think the Met Office has about 24 Class 1 sites only. So Cawood is actually sort of a Class 1 site. According to WMO, it's in the middle of, gives you, a very, very clear record of the surrounding temperature. So you type that in, and it doesn't provide the estimate for Cawood, even though they've had data going back many, many years. I think it's well over 30 years. What they then say is there are 5 sites nearby where you can go and look at the estimated data. So you look at those 5 sites, and 4 of them are closed, and 4 of them have estimated data. The 5th is still open, but it's 27 miles away, and it's at a much higher elevation. So if you type in Cawood to get a specific location for temperature data, you will get data that's been estimated from 4 close stations nearby. You will not get the data from Cawood, which they presumably have and would be actually pristine. And then the last one is obviously one that's 27 miles away. Why are they doing this? He's just come up with another one. Norwich is the same. Now there are weather stations at Norwich. We know that it was once a sort of I think it's a centre of the Met Office. They're closely connected with the nearby University of East Anglia. I think they used to do weather forecasts on TV there. So we know there's an airport there, so there'd probably be almost certainly be one there. You type in Norwich, and there's no data. There's no data on a 30-year basis, even though, as I say, they've had stations we know going back 100 years or so. And the 5 they provide there, all 5 are closed. All 5 don't exist. So for an area where we presume they have very good data, they're saying, well, you go to the data that we're estimating from 5 stations that don't exist anymore. And this goes on and on and on. And as I say, by asking them, a year ago for this data, we can look and look and look, and we can find that this actual, this data set is just, a lot of it's been estimated, it's been made up, it's been computer modeled. Then we look at what they do internationally. They have an operation called HADCRUP, which is the global database where they take figures from UK all around the world. Now, what have they been up to there? Well, they've been since 2013, there have been 2 revisions, retrospective revisions of HADCRUP, which produces this global temperature, the 1.2, 1.3, all that sort of stuff. We look at what they've been doing. Since 2013, there have been two upgrades, HADCRUP 4, and now we're on HADCRUP 5. And each time, they increased recent global warming by 15%. They added 15%. And not only that, they decreased it in the past before that. So it's the old hockey stick comes in. So they're not only feeding in junk data, they seem to be also adjusting temperatures to fit what you could call, the cynical might suggest, is a narrative that the world is warming more than it probably is. The world is warming, but probably not quite as much as the Met Office tell us. And finally, of course, you asked about, all this has been well known in social media. But the Scottish Daily Express did a similar, in January, I was intrigued to see, they did a similar FOI, and they found for Scotland, they looked specifically at Scotland, they found there are only 2 stations and 91 stations, I think, in Scotland. Only 2 were in Class 1, and they did quite a big piece about how, the junk stations and how unreliable all this data is. The Met Office needs to get its act together. It's gone down this, crazy net zero route. There's a lot of activists in there. There's a lot of good scientists in the Met Office. It does a great job, for instance, in forecasting. It's got much more information now from satellites. But unfortunately, it's allowed its temperature measuring sites in the UK to become hopelessly corrupted by the growth of cities, urbanizations, by all sorts of nearby things that are growing up around them. And they're using, a lot of airport information. They've allowed it to become highly corrupted, and the activists are using it for purposes that, quite frankly, it was not intended for, and is actually not useful for anyway.
Many such cases. Okay, well, Chris Morrison, thank you very much for coming on The Sceptic.
Delighted as always. See you, Laurie.
Now, according to the Jay Inquiry, between 1997 and 2013, at least 1,400 girls were groomed, raped and abused by predominantly Pakistani heritage gangs in Rotherham, northern England. So sickening were the crimes and the institutional failings that facilitated them that the word Rotherham itself has become a grim shorthand for the horror of the rape gang scandal more widely. And it's still going on today. No official has yet gone to prison. Earlier this month, another rape gang was convicted. Well, now, in an apparent effort to change the town's image, Rotherham has been made the world's first children's capital of culture, a government-backed initiative for Rotherham to celebrate its young people and their creativity.
In 2025, we will become the world's first children's capital of culture.
That's 365 days of non-stop fun, brought to you by people like me,
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 and me.
it's what we've always dreamed of.
an opportunity.
Some might call this tone-deaf, others might call it sick. But just what is going through the heads of our woke elites? Well, to discuss that, I'm very pleased to be joined by Stephen Tucker, who's a journalist and the author of 10 books, including Hitler and Stalin's Misuse of Science. Welcome to The Sceptic, Stephen.
Hello, good to be back.
Yeah, good to have you here. Okay, so Stephen, you've written for us recently on this and the dark, but in some ways darkly humorous fact that Rotherham has been made the children's capital of culture for this year. And I think to start with, I mean, because someone must have been somewhere making that decision and in charge of saying, you know, where should we have the children's capital of culture? Oh yeah, let's put it in Rotherham, the place where there was the rape gang scandal. And I mean, so to start with, do you have a sense of what they were thinking there?
Well, it's almost, there's that old saying, isn't it, that the left tend not to have much of a sense of humour, and in this case, they seem not to have much of a sense of irony, really, because there is a certain sense of dark humour here. I mean, a number of commenters below the line, when they heard about this, made reference to, it sounds like something from the League of Gentlemen, with Rotherham standing in for Royston Vasey, the kind of town in that comedy programme. And it almost seems as if they're mocking the children involved. I mean, I'm sure they're not, but it does ultimately almost come across as darkly humorous, because especially if you look at some of the events that are actually being put on there. They've got a band, for instance, called Bloodstained Reputation, which seems somehow appropriate, and they set up this pop-up cafe called the Tell the Truth to Power Cafe, in which children were asked to come in to celebrate the capital of culture, the children's culture, the first ever time it's been awarded. And they were supposed to ask questions about who is it who holds power over us and what kind of questions would you like to ask them. And which, if any children from the local area went in there and said, well, the people who hold power over us were clearly the Pakistani rape gangs, and we'd like to ask them, you know, why did you do this? Why are you here? Why can't you just go back to, to where you came from? If that's the kind of thing.
That's the end of the free part of the podcast. If you'd like to listen to the bonus interview, you'll need to become a regular donor to the Daily Sceptic. For as little as £5 a month, not only will you be able to watch or listen to the whole podcast, you'll also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion forum on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest content on the Daily Sceptic with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. Once you've become a donor, log in to the Daily Sceptic using the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Remember, you can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailysceptic.org/donate.